Yeah, and many of the often cited examples of evolution involve devolution. And in those cases, an organism or a molecular machine devolves in a way that gives it a niche advantage, but at the cost of overall fitness.
Yeah, and my co-author Matti Lasola, who's a very successful bioengineer in Finland. He spent several years in Switzerland. He was both at very respected universities and also in private industry doing cutting edge work with proteins, with enzymes. And he said a lot of the best thing they did when they would go in and accelerate random evolution on enzymes, with bombarding them with certain things, is like finally they'd get something a little useful, but it was always like it would break something. And I think it's Michael Behe gives the example of, you could have a rusty lock on a door that rusts shut, and depending on your situation, that might actually be useful. You might not have any need to go in and out of that door, but you might want it to be very secure. And so now it's really hard to get through, harder than before when you just had a flimsy little lock on it. But you're not going to build a house with rust just because that rusted door provided this niche advantage. And that's the kind of small, positive, beneficial mutations that Michael Behe's talked about in The Edge of Evolution. He's got another book coming. That'll be very exciting. What Matti Lasola saw in all his enzyme research. You'll get these little changes that will create a niche advantage, but when you go and look at what the change was, it's something got broken or jammed, and that created a niche benefit. A lot of bacteria that develop antibiotic resistance, when you take away the antibiotic, that antibiotic-resistant bacteria gets outcompeted by the more common strain of bacteria. So basically that antibiotic-resistant bacteria lost some sort of overall functionality to become a specialist. It's like a greyhound dog is not going to outcompete a wolf in the wild. Its ancestor, a wolf in the wild, it's going to be able to outsprint it, but the wolf's going to outcompete it 10-1. If you just throw a batch of greyhounds and a batch of wolves on an island, you're going to come back 20 years later and you're probably mostly going to have wolves.
You sort of alluded to this earlier on. You mentioned Darwin's tree of life, and I think that, underscores a very, very significant issue, and that is you have these icons, and inevitably icons turn into the argument. So instead of having a defensible argument, you just make these dogmatic assertions, and oftentimes you don't even assert anything. You simply point at the icon.
Right, yeah. There's, and we touched on a few of those. One of the new ones that's really come to light, and it's not brand new, but my colleague Jonathan Wells, in his recent book Zombie Science, he highlighted it's the eye, the vertebrate eye. Humans are vertebrates, and so we have this kind of eye. You'll get, Oxford biologist Richard Dawkins. You'll get these very, there's a guy named Lentz who's come out with a book recently. Will say, well, the human eye, the vertebrate eye, is wired backwards. It's crazy. It creates this tiny little blind spot. No intelligent designer would have done it that way, but Darwinism would. Darwinism is a makeshift, tinkering, trial and error, random process. So we shouldn't be surprised that it creates this weird backward wiring. But a designer, an all-wise God, wouldn't. Well, they've known. Eye specialists in biology have known for, I think, decades that this backward wiring actually dramatically improves oxygen flow, which is very important for these very oxygen-hungry eye cells we have in our eyes, which are just extraordinary. They were doing recent research in, it was like a quantum mechanics type test, but they needed the human eye, and maybe they were using some other animal eye, to detect a single photon. Can you imagine? Photons are insanely small. I mean, they make electrons look like boulders. But apparently the vertebrate eye can detect a single photon, and of course it's able to get all that oxygen it needs. It does all this amazing stuff. It's light years ahead of any human camera technology. There's a good reason for that backward wiring. It's constrained optimization, a basic engineering concept. And yet you get guys like Richard Dawkins that think they just have this slam dunk icon. Look at the backward wiring of the eye. That's Darwinism. That's not intelligent design. They don't even bother. They're so sure of themselves, or at least maybe they're so afraid of the evidence for design that they don't even engage the other side enough to realize that they're trotting out very threadbare arguments.
You know what you ought to do is elaborate a little bit on this constrained optimization. A lot of people hear that. They're not sure what that is, but I mean, I think it's an incredibly important concept for people to grab a hold of.
Yeah, well, like right now I've got some notes from our discussion here in front of me on my notebook computer. What if somebody walked in and says, "Yeah, notebook computer's lame, man. I've got a TV in my living room that has a 58-inch screen. Your notebook computer only has a 15, 17-inch screen." We would think the person needed to be have something very basic explained to them. This notebook computer, I can take it. I can go to the coffee shop with it. I can take it with me on trips. I can go upstairs. I can go downstairs. I can move out to my backyard with it. The screen's big enough for 95, 98% of the purposes I need. If I want to, I can plug into a bigger screen. So it's constrained optimization. If they designed it with a huge screen, it wouldn't be portable. And so hopefully at that point, a light bulb would go on. And that's constrained optimization. You can have a sports car that maneuvers and it's fast. It hugs the road very well. Accelerates incredibly well. But it's not going to have the best gas mileage. It's not going to have the best storage capacity. There was a constrained optimization. There were trade-offs that had to be made to make it the best sports car. Just same with a pickup, same with some other kind of car, fuel economy car. So with that eye, the designer said, you know what, I'm going to do some amazing things in terms of what this eye is going to be able to see. It's going to make those light-sensitive cells very oxygen hungry. I'm going to go in and backward wire. It's going to create this tiny little blind spot, which then gets fixed because you've got two eyes, and most people don't even know they have a blind spot. It's so minor, it's so inconsequential. So there's this tiny little negative trade-off for this huge positive, and so that's a classic example of skilled constrained optimization. So and you'll often have engineers that are much more likely to be pro-intelligent design because they intuitively get this constrained optimization concept. They intuitively see a brilliant work of engineering and they say that had to be designed.
You have written so much. I mean, I think about the articles you have written for Touchstone, for the Princeton Theological Review, for the Oxford Literature and Theology, for the Seattle Times, for the Kansas City Star, for Breakpoint. I mean, I go on and on. You have written so many articles, but there's an interesting article that caught my attention in which you analyze the results of a recent survey that suggests that Americans reject evolution. Why? Because they are simply uninformed. Talk about that.
Oh, right. Yeah, there was a survey. I can't remember the university, but it was a study. It was in bioscience. They reported on the survey. And they concluded that, hey, the more literate young people are about science and the more you expose them and teach them about evolution, the more they accept evolutionary theory. And so the unstated implication was, maybe it was stated at some point, was, well, that's what we'd expect because there's all this great evidence for evolution. And once you can just get people past some of the goofy objections, they will accept it. But I went into, having with my background in English and in wordsmithing and language, I went and took a careful look at the survey, and I very quickly started seeing problems. For instance, when they were trying to find out what a person's view is, they would leave out key possibilities. Like there really wasn't for instance, an old Earth creationist view, which anybody that spends 20 minutes in the creation ID evolution landscape will be aware that there's a significant group of people that think the universe is old, but God created it. There isn't common descent evolution. God's designing things. He designed humans independently. So that immediately set off warning bells. And then another time, another place in the survey, they were implying that they were saying that there was this correlation between understanding evolution and acceptance. But then the way they worded some of the questions, you really had to buy into evolution to get the answer right. So the questions conflated understanding and acceptance. It would be like asking a question, do you agree that LeBron James is the greatest basketball player, in fact, the greatest athlete who has ever lived? And somebody answering, no, I think it was Michael Jordan or Pele or whatever. Oh, they don't understand basketball. They don't accept that LeBron James is the greatest. Well, that doesn't tell you if understanding basketball and accepting LeBron James is the greatest. You're conflating things. So there were weird things like that, and the sort of mistakes bright people could only make if they had been extremely insulated from the other position, if they'd had no meaningful contact and conversations, iron sharpening iron, with any pro-intelligent design people.
That's one of the problems, though, and I think it bears elaboration. You think about the fact that we live in an age of information overload. There's so much information being pumped down the pike, and you never really have an opportunity to process it. And as a result of that, people don't know how to think anymore.
Yeah, that's a separate problem, but it's a big problem, is that people mistake being able to bounce around the internet and have their fingers on any little bit of trivia, mistake that for learning, for wisdom. I think parents, educators, we've got to recognize that there's this serious problem with kids not learning to kind of dive deep, be quiet. What was it that Pascal said? All of man's troubles derived from this is inability to sit still in a room. Well, that gets doubled and trebled when the person's sitting still in a room with with an iPhone in front of him or her.
I want to get back to one of your books that is an all-time favorite at the Christian Research Institute, A Meaningful World. I mentioned it at the outset of the podcast, but this book is subtitled How the Arts and Sciences Reveal the Genius of Nature. How do the arts and sciences reveal the genius of nature?
Yeah, what we did in that book, Ben Weicker and I, is we went through and showed that you can go across cultures and across mediums, whether it's literature or painting. We spent most of our time in literature because that was my background. But we argued that there are these certain common markers that you find for works that are designated, widely designated as a work of genius, whether it's, Dante's Divine Comedy or Shakespeare's work or, a great symphony or opera by Mozart. There's depth to it. You might say richness, but there's this depth where you can keep digging and finding, which is their wisdom, insight, beauty. There's this radiant clarity to it. You kind of understand the world or feel the world in a new way, or you become re-familiarized, or you become reawakened to some beauty that you'd become deadened to because of the work of art. There's a harmony, there's an elegance. So we went through and explained those, and we gave some examples from Shakespeare's Hamlet, his comedy Much Ado About Nothing, and then we showed, okay, so Shakespeare, he's considered, maybe the greatest playwright, in all the world, certainly, in the English-speaking world. And so now let's go over to nature and see if we find these markers. And of course, we went through and showed that you find these markers of depth, radiant clarity, harmony, and elegance. You find them in a far greater degree in biology and chemistry and astronomy, physics, all across the board. So we said it's not just evidence of design that we find evidence of extraordinarily ingenious design.